to moderate our next conversation, I'd like to welcome to the stage HillVets lead protege, Nick Mararac.
So I'm excited for our next topic. It's Do Ask, Do Tell, exploring the intersections of the LGBTQ plus military and veteran community through the past, present, and future, with Jennifer Dane, the CEO of Modern Military Association of America. This is a timely conversation because last year was the 10-year anniversary of the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and also the second time that the transgender ban was also repealed. And as of right now, the repeal of the trans ban has yet to be codified. So Jen, thank you for joining us today and lending us your expertise and your experience in advocating for LGBTQ military members, veterans, and their families. As a queer and gay person and veteran who served during Don't Ask, Don't Tell, it's really an honor to share the stage with you today. Jennifer Dane is a veteran of the United States Air Force. She served as an intelligence analyst and focused on geopolitical relations, terrorism, and threat vulnerability issues. And in addition to being the CEO of Modern Military American Association, whose focus is on advancing fairness and equality for the LGBTQ military and veteran community, she also serves as the founding board member of Partners in Promise, which focuses on advocating on behalf of the military's Exceptional Family Members Program. And before going into some of the advocacy work that she's done, Jen, would you like to describe what led you to join the military, what that experience was like, and why you continue to do the service work you do today?
Absolutely, and thank you for moderating, and thank you, HillVets, for letting me be here. I am actually a first-generation military member. I just remember waking up one day feeling like there was something missing, and it was a call to service, and I don't really know where that came from. I knew that one day I wanted to be a U.S. Senator, and that was at 13 years old. I had that passion. And I still want to do that. But I knew one of the best things for upward mobility for me in my life as I lived in a very small rural West Texas town, and there was not much upward mobility that was accessible to me. My parents had never went to college. Really didn't have a pathway set for me. And I thought the military was not only my call to service for me after 9/11, but also a way that I could, make sure that my future was set. I joined a little bit later in life at 22 years old. I was tired of working 4 jobs just to survive, and I didn't know what else to do. So I decided to enlist in the Air Force at 22 in Amarillo, Texas. If anybody knows where that is, it's very, very conservative, small town up in West Texas. So before that, growing up, I always struggled with understanding my identity with being a Christian and also my identity with being an LGBTQ person. And so I thought this would be a really good start to get out and explore, who I was as a person. So I joined in 2010, and that was at the tail end of the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And I remember sitting in the military, exam processing station, and they said, "You're going to have to sign this paper." And I still have it at my desk. I should have brought it with me. But it said, if you were ever found out to conduct homosexual conduct, you'd be discharged and punished under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And if anybody knows anything about that, they're like upwards of life or death in prison or whatnot. And there were folks that did serve prison time for Don't Ask, Don't Tell as well, just so you know. I was not one of them. But what led me here to be the CEO, I call myself an accidental advocate. Because in 2010, I successfully made it through basic training. I went on to intelligence technical school. And during my first year, like 1 in 3 women in the military and 1 in 12 men, I am a survivor of military sexual trauma. And I decided that at that moment that if I was going to be that supervisor that advocated for my troops to report the incident, that I needed to do so. So I reported it. But what I couldn't tell the Air Force or the Air Force attorneys was that the reason that I wouldn't want that experience was because I was LGBTQ. So when we went to the Article 15 hearing, the defense called me into their office and said, "Are you gay?" And I said, "I can't really tell you that. I can't tell you if I'm gay." They're like, "Oh, no, it's about to be." I'm like, "I can't tell you." So I had to hire an attorney or call Area Defense Counsel at a different base in Texas and had to disclose who I was, because it was an investigation that was started into discharging me from the military because they found out that. And because I couldn't share my true, anything that happened, the unintended consequences of Don't Ask, Don't Tell was, the person being found not guilty and me just, being investigated, because I couldn't share the true evidence of the case. And I think that now, looking back, it may have been a different lawsuit now. But saying that to say is, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed in 2010. The investigation stopped. But I think for me, the military sexual trauma was not the most painful thing, but it was the investigation of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So the unintended consequences of policy that was meant for good in 1993 was that I was investigated and I was the one that was victimized in the process. So I finished my military career, and I didn't want anything to do with the military. In 2016, I said, no, I'm good. I'm done with the military. But I went to grad school to get my PhD at Ohio State, and it just kept on coming, these things, these nudges. And I decided to go back into the community and join. And I became... During that time, I became the diversity and inclusion policy analyst, because I was really interested in looking at the policies for the transgender service ban and the codification of that or lifting of that for service members, because I had a lot of friends that were trans, and I wanted to make sure they were able to serve if they were capable and qualified. And then in 2019, I found out that the American Military Partner Association and OutServe, SLDN, two of the major organizations, decided to merge. And they brought me on as their education director. And shortly after that, in 2020, the day that the world shut down, I was appointed the CEO the interim CEO of the modern military. And then I obviously went on to become the CEO of the organization that I lead today. We are 85,000 members strong. We've got chapters in all states across the country. We advocate from birth of a service member's family member to the veteran side, the grave, making sure that we emphasize military service, veteran service, and their families, caregivers, allies, supporters. And next year we'll mark our 30th year as a conglomeration of organizations. So a long answer for your short question.
No, I think a lot of that also parallels some of the feelings I had experienced when I served during Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So I really appreciate that vulnerability that you're conveying to us today. Also, if anyone is aware, women during Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and even before Don't Ask, Don't Tell, were unequally affected percentage-wise by the discriminatory policy. So we had more women who were either, even if they didn't identify as homosexual, were getting targeted if they were sexually harassed and reporting their harassers. So it didn't really matter whether or not they identified as a lesbian or not, because they were still affected by the ban. It's not often that we have representation of, so I'll use the term queer to speak of the LGBTQ community more broadly. It's not often that we have queer people representing us in policy and doing the research that is needed to understand this demographic within the military and within veteran communities. And when I think of why that's a challenge, it's because so much of the HVAC and the SVAC, for instance, or the House and Senate committees on Veterans Affairs is mostly old white men. And a lot of the VSOs are mostly old white men. So how do you navigate that?
Well, I think right now in the current space, we have really great champions. I mean, we have Representative Chicano is in office, and he is an out legislator. We also have Senator Julie Brown, or not senator, I want her to be senator, I guess. I just put her there. Representative Brownlee that does a lot of good for women veterans, and that does overflow into the queer community. And I think really just for us, I mean, there's other people like Representative Mace is there, and I think that, this issue, veterans, I may represent an LGBTQ community, but at large, my central focus is on the veteran and the service member and their families. That's not a partisan issue. My life may be a partisan issue to some people, but I think that if we can, come together and say, we're at the crux of it, we are all for veterans, especially in those committees. They don't usually want to ask the people that are not too friendly of me. They don't want to usually ask me questions, and so I usually don't get those questions, but I'm always prepared. But it's just showing up and saying, these are our experiences, and kind of storytelling. Because I think whenever you humanize something and you humanize somebody's experience, and do it in a way that's, very strategic, and for me, like my policy advocacy is looking at like how can we strategically make an effort, maybe not this legislative session, but in maybe the 127th Congress, because we're at the 117th. But what can I do to make a difference 10 years from now, that it makes it easier for for the service members that are serving when they become veterans? So I play the long game, and not everybody likes to do it like that. They want the revolution. But I think that incrementalism is the easiest way to do that. And if we can get one thing done per Congress, which is really difficult sometimes, to just do one for our community, and if we come together, and I think the coming together of organizations and having the allyship has been probably the most impactful, like having the American Legion, or we did an advocacy day with Iraq and Afghanistan, or IAVA, and they were there, and they were like, we are allies with you. And having those major voices on the Hill saying, we support you, those communities, is the way to get there. And then also, we just tell people to vote. We don't tell them who to vote for, because I don't think that should be, we're a nonprofit, 501c3, so we're not telling them. But if you want to make a change, you need to vote. And I don't really care who you vote for, as long as you're informed and you get up and vote. So whenever, whenever the opportunities to go and advocate are open, we can do that.
Thank you. Since most of us here I like to think that we're all change leaders. Is that a new buzzword for people who want to have social impact? Yesterday I had the opportunity to ask a member of Congress if they would support codifying the repeal of the transgender ban. And their response was pretty much no, and they don't think that folks should acknowledge something that's not true. It was unfortunate, but so how, as folks who are interested in working in this field, advocacy, affecting policy, how can we have meaningful conversations with leaders on the Hill, as well as their constituents? Because ultimately, in theory, these legislators are representing their constituents.
Well, I think the number one way is, first thing is, if folks don't know, there are about 6 known sex markers. We only identify the XX and the XY, but there are actually about 6 of them that are pretty prominent in science. There's also folks that are intersex, which means they're born with both, or maybe one that's more dominant. Those may be a small number, but those are representative of it. And I think just for people that, I think it's the storytelling. We bring those troops, we bring those families in and say, this is not something made up, because it is not something that is, being transgender, you don't just go through that as a social experiment. That is how you were born, that's how you represent. And I think that, we need to push them more on those issues and bring more, awareness and education. We don't know if you've never met a trans person, you may be scared of them, because it's kind of like, because of what we see in the news. But the more media representation and the more storytelling and the more reality that we have, the easier it becomes. Not too long ago, being lesbian, gay, or bisexual was in the DSM as a mental disorder. So we've came a long way, or the sterilization process of those folks. So I think as we evolve as a society and as norms become easier. And then we actually also put candidates in that affirm those beliefs. I think that's pretty important. And if they're not representing their constituents, then, there needs to be some challenge on that, especially for our service members and their families that do so much, and our veteran communities that do so much for the country because there's only so many people that do that or have the accessibility to do that. Yesterday
we were able to ask, speaking to, veterans should be receiving the benefits that they're entitled to, a group of panelists about what they thought about military exceptionalism, the idea that service members and veterans are like above citizens because of their service. While the panelists' insights varied, one point they each shared was that veterans should receive the benefits they're entitled to. Could you speak to some of the reasons that queer service members are not receiving those benefits?
Yeah, so obviously Don't Ask, Don't Tell was a big one, spoiler alert. But we know that since the end of World War II, until the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, 114,000 service members were discharged either dishonorably or other than honorable, simply for being lesbian, gay, or bisexual. And today, only about 3% of those have received upgrades for their discharges. Why is that the case? Is because after Don't Ask, Don't Tell, everyone thought the problem was solved. And also there's a lot of trauma that comes with being discharged for being any of those as a community that was lesbian, gay, or bisexual. Transgender folks were discharged for other reasons, so I don't want to exclude them from the conversation, but that was a different time. But because of those discharges, the implications of that goes beyond, the veteran benefits they get. They're not able, until this year, or last year, I believe, Secretary McDonough said that, if you have an other than honorable discharge, you can actually get benefits through the VA. And we've seen that to not be successful, actually. And there's still much more work to be done. I know the VA is doing a really good job of trying to make changes, and they are working toward that, and we work very closely with them. But the process is so difficult. During the pandemic, they closed the Records Correction Board, and they also closed the National Archives, which meant the 2 to 3 years that our folks were waiting for their discharges were put completely on hold. So we had folks that didn't have access to that. That were in the process. We've had folks that were 5 to 6 years through the process. I've been the executive director since 2020, and we have probably about 100 people a month come to us to ask for assistance. And since 2020, I've only seen one discharge successfully be upgraded. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, because there's other organizations like Swords and Plowshares doing excellent work. We're working with other attorneys. There's also other groups that are doing discharge upgrades. But just from our point of view, we've seen none of those. So that means they can't get disability benefits. They can't receive the home loans. They can't receive federal hiring practices preferences. But if you apply to any of these veteran organizations, fellowships or programs, on almost every single one of them, it says you have an honorable discharge. Almost every single one of them. And what do you do for those queer folks that were discharged simply for being themselves and can't even get access to the networking and resources that they need to maybe for upward mobility when they can't even get to the door because you've already shut the door on them? So it means we're strategically marginalizing them in ways that are not intended to be such, but that are such. And so this also means that, they can't get caregiving services if they are in need of that. They can't, if they're 100% disabled, your spouse will get VA insurance, or they will get education benefits. That means they're exempt from that. So there's a lot of strategic marginalization that happens. And if you don't have the cultural competencies to reach out, and because the DoD has barred research on lesbian, gay, and bisexual folks since at least 1993. And only a month ago did they say that was, they struck that down actually about a month ago. So there's never been we don't know how many LGBTQ service members we have. We don't know how many LGBTQ veterans we have. So there's a huge problem. And we've been working with, Cerner now work with Cerner to make sure that our records management, the health disparities are seen in a better light. But we don't know what the health disparities are for folks since we don't know who they are. And we can't do strategic and targeted outreach or at least suggest it to the VA because we don't know who these people are. So this is one thing that my wish would be that if you had a discharge code that said homosexual conduct, that we could just go through the records and just upgrade all those. And that would be like, for me, that would be the magic solution for a lot of those. And not only that, we do have people that have honorable discharges that have a reenlistment code that says homosexual conduct on it, still today. So whenever people are applying for jobs or they're asked to provide their DD-214s and they cannot reenlist, the condition says homosexual conduct. So you're outing them every single time. And for folks that, for coming out is a personal process, and that's one that I would never want on my service records. I want it to be a process where I can come out on my own or not, whatever I choose.
Actually, speaking of when homosexuality was pathologized, it was around World War II, and then there were so many queer people in the prison system that they decided to switch over to a penal system and administratively discharge people who were accused of being homosexual. Not to backtrack, but were you able to reach out to like SLDN during your time in the military?
So at the time, I didn't even know that the organization existed. It wasn't until later that OutServe merged with SLDN. And for folks that don't know who OutServe is, and the SLDN was a Service Legal Defense Network, and they were the main group that helped repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and we're on like the stage when Obama signed the repeal and everything, and it's still folks that we keep in contact with today. But I didn't know I didn't know anybody that was gay, and it wasn't until later I became a chapter leader of OutServe in Arizona that. It's kind of funny because it was all on Facebook, and you had to get like triply vetted just to get accepted into these groups. And I was really concerned that although Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, I was like, well, maybe they'll come and find me because we didn't know how long it may stick or not stick, and I didn't want to be outed again. So it was an interesting process of figuring out like that secret knock that you had to get into this organization. And it wasn't until last year that we made actually the chapter searchable on Facebook, that you can actually search for an MMAA chapter in the area because it was such a personal and privacy issue that some of our folks in those chapters were actually being investigated by the Office of Special Investigations. And we know that a lot of witch hunts occurred during Don't Ask, Don't Tell and prior. We did not want them to get a master repository of who we were as a community. So I don't know if that answered your question. Oh, did I reach out to them? No, I did not. And I wish I would have known about them because, and I go back and look, and for me, I always want to recognize the history that comes with my job because if it wasn't for those service members that stood out and stood up and outed themselves, I can't, without them doing that, I couldn't be where I am today.
Thank you. Throughout today and yesterday, we talked about the happiness index and how social media has been so terrible for people. But for queer people, it has offered, especially queer people in rural parts of the nation, access to queer communities and speak to other people. I remember OutServe very well. I don't want to age myself because my undergrads think I'm 26. In 2008, joining OutServe on Facebook and being able to connect with other junior officers and more importantly, JAG officers and understand some of the legal nuance that I might have to navigate if I ever enter those precarious waters. But at that time, it was predominantly gay men. So as a woman, how did you navigate that? And if you could also talk to some of the inequalities that folks of intersectional identities, if we're familiar with Kimberly Crenshaw's term, which is a metaphor for understanding the compounding forms of inequalities that people experience based on their identities, such as race and gender, It was originally used to understand the inequalities that Black women face. Could you speak to that as well through your experience and what you see today?
Yeah, I mean, our organization still struggles with the identity of it being predominantly white gay men and trying to change that and opening up arms to other folks. I mean, obviously, having me as a CEO, it helps a little bit to be more welcoming. And we still, I mean, obviously the intersectionality between being LGBTQ and a person of color or different social economical statuses and education and all that and or status, it really is, difficult to navigate because we'd love to reach out to other folks. But, even being a welcoming space for other identities has been a challenge. And I think, whenever I served, I was was the lowest ranking person usually in the room. I was the only woman in the room, usually briefing, 3 and 4-star generals, whenever I did intel. So it was a space I occupied quite frequently. So me in this role, it's been, I wouldn't say easy because it's still challenging. But, for me, it's been an opportunity to say, we're not just the white male heteronormative example of a veteran. And I think anybody would say veterans are multifaceted. But breaking into the barriers, I think even in our veteran service organizations, the one thing that does stifle me, or in the military service organizations that I work with, is I am much younger than most of the leaders. And it's been really hard because they think that I don't know it all, and I will admit that. I know a lot about everything. I know a little about a lot of things, let me say that. But I think, when we talk about the next generation, we still have these old ideas that are implanted in our military service organizations or our veteran service organizations that may work for, those older generations, but it's, the big 6, which is, the American Legion, the Paralyzed Veterans of America, VFW, and all those other ones. There's going to be a time whenever their tactics of recruiting don't fit the mold. And so what do you do when the big 6 almost literally dies? And so we need to really strategically look at, finding those intersections and saying, you encapsulate more than just your being a veteran. For me, I am a mom, a Pelotoner, I am a veteran. I just happen to be lesbian. And there's all these identities that we can connect on. And I think it's realizing those strengths that we all have, and really focusing on that, and also doing it together, because I think we've siloed a lot of our communities and said this organization only represents this and this and this. But when we come together and say hey, can everybody get together and say these are the number 1 issues for this legislative session, and come together and say, yeah, we all support that. It would be really helpful. I think that we wouldn't have 114,000 discharges still pending if somebody the VFW or the American Legion, or all of them really, came out and said, there's inequalities that we need to fix. Just like we did with burn pit legislation. Exactly like that. That's a great example of all of us standing together and saying, this is enough, we're done. And we have a program called Restore Honor and Restore Dignity. And, something that just the right thing to do. That's really all of it is just, right now it's the right thing to do. And, whenever I talk about, doing it for the veteran, one of the things at the VA that is lacking is, one of the areas is family building. And for LGBTQ members, it's kind of hard to family build with 2 same-sex couples. it just doesn't work that way. And in the VA, we've been able to not only advocate for LGBTQ members, but if you do have an infertility service-connected disability, you have to be married, and you have to be able to produce either both the sperm and the egg. And if you can't do that, then you can't qualify for those services. So whenever you have a single person that has infertility, they can't access those services. And if you're LGBTQ, you can't. So those commonalities make us stronger so that we can say, let's do this together. And doing it together makes much more makes results happen and much at a much more timely effect.
I want to ask one more question before I open it up to the floor. You spoke about finding common ground and how burn pits was one of them. Do you think that the different VSOs can come together and the other MSOs to find common ground in how some of these like discriminatory legislations in some of these states like Florida and Texas that are passing and how they're affecting national security?
Well, I would hope so. I mean, like we know that there's over 200 bills that were introduced in state legislation that targeted anti-LGBTQ population, or that was targeted for anti-LGBTQ laws, and that's just obviously on the state level. And then in Texas and Florida, we saw anti-trans laws. Well, in Florida, we saw anti-gay, but in Texas specifically, there was anti-trans legislation that was introduced. So for folks that aren't aware, if you are seeking gender-affirming care for a child that's under 18, if you were turned in, you could be investigated for Child Protective Services and get your child taken away. So we do know that there are, at least in the Air Force, there's about 114 families that do have that are getting treatment for their transgender dependent or their transgender child, and they're really worried. And they're worried about, what is their next steps? Do they leave the military? Do they hide? Is somebody from, Maryland going to call Texas and report them because they knew who they were at a different base? Are they going to be charged with child abuse? And these are real concerns that we have. And I know, whenever, Texas happened, the first people that I emailed was the First Lady's office. They probably heard from me way too much, and making sure that families are protected. And I went and talked to the Department of Defense because this is a national security issue. If you are having families leave the service that are of these specialties, it's national security. We could have retained that talent if we just took care of their kids. And they shouldn't, you shouldn't have to worry about defending our country and then going home and defending your family. It should not be about that. And, I don't care if you're against the idea of transgender families. I don't. But as long as, you've signed up for the service and they should take care of you at all costs. And you should not be charged with child abuse for simply doing what you do for kids. And we know that, I think one affirming adult will decrease suicidality in LGBTQ kids by 70%. So if we just have one affirming adult that does that, I may be wrong on those statistics. So you can go to Trevor Project. They have better statistics than that. But I know that, if we can come together and say, no, we need to do better. We've got to do better. Because we also know that military families also create more military families. And so if we're cutting off the pipeline at them being their true selves, then we're cutting off our retention, recruitment, and our talent pool. And if we're not being inclusive, maybe the family isn't LGBTQ, or nobody is LGBTQ in the family. But if their friends can't join the military, they're not going to join either. Because you have an organization that is not inclusive, not providing benefits. And so we're really going to see a problem with recruiting and retention. We're already seeing one, of course, but we're going to see an even bigger one as time goes by. No one's going to want to go to places that are anti-LGBTQ. They're going to choose their family, or they're going to geo-batch, or they're going to leave the service early because of that. And I think that, economically, we've got to make some bold decisions. Are we going to move? Texas also has Lackland, which is the Air Force's recruiting station, basic training. That's what the word is. I had a bad time at basic training, so try to forget that time. My recruiter went to jail. That's how bad it was. Or about my recruiter, my drill instructor went to jail. So we're going to have to really strategically think about what this looks like whenever we're looking at services. And we have tons of bases in Texas, tons of bases in Florida, tons of bases in Alabama, tons of bases in the South. What are you going to do? It may first be LGBTQ, but we know with Roe versus Wade, next is same-sex marriage, next is interracial marriage, next could be contraceptive care. it just like leads to a rabbit hole of, when does it stop? And it needs to stop before it even starts. And unfortunately, that was an unintended consequence of Roe versus Wade being overturned.
I think it's something that's very powerful about what you said is because there is this civilian-military divide, and there is obviously civilian oversight on the military. But if we are able to focus on national security and how some of this legislation affects national security by discriminating against queer family members, we can have impact outside the military as well in these states, because they're stakeholders in maintaining these bases. And also, I'm sure that they're also interested in national security as well. Speaking to recruitment as well, in working with undergraduate students and teaching undergraduate students at Georgetown University, I see them interested in service as well also. But they're going to like FBI, CIA, State Department, but that's also because Georgetown's kind of a pipeline for that pathway. But they're not interested in the military. So we're losing talent to other organizations, other institutions that are more inclusive than the military. So if anyone has any questions, please, I would like to open up the floor.
Thank you for being here, Ms. Dane. So yesterday, Secretary Hagel stated that once trust is lost, it is extremely hard to earn back. And for a lot of LGBT veterans and their families, that trust has been lost multiple times, I think. So how can we as allies in the community now unite those LGBT veterans to participate in studies and research so that we can accurately advocate for them on the national level?
That's a great question. One that I get asked more often than not, and I think that the trust is pretty much gone. I mean, they don't want to be. It's fear. I mean, for me, I'm a researcher too at heart, and I take every single study that comes up across my desk. But I think you've got to, as an ally, you've got to create like an avenue of trust with somebody that's part of the community. So creating things like an ambassador program, or creating something whenever you have a face that you trust, to say like, and incentivizing, maybe your respondents with, they're first going to be engaged with somebody that's part of the community. Because if you want to sit down with, I'll take any interview, but not everybody will. And if they don't feel like they're trusted, or you don't understand their experience, or it's a sacred space that they're going to be judged again, especially when it relates to their military experience, you've got to just enable other tools. And that's really just creating trust through someone else. And that's what I've seen to be the most effective. And I say, like, with Blue Star Families, they do a wonderful survey, but we never can get the N, which is the number of respondents. We can never get that to be statistically significant for LGBTQ respondents. And I've told them a lot that they should, create some of these community ambassadors so that we can actually get the participant. And we, at our organization, we'd love to create that research, but funding. It's really easy to fund, military families at large. But when you talk about like a subpopulation, like, especially when it's not a popular topic for LGBTQ individuals, I think it's really difficult. But I think there's a huge gap of research and knowledge that has to be garnered for this community to really understand that. And when we understand some of these, we can understand a lot more of the complexities within other communities as well.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Jennifer. Jimmy Santos, City of Boston, also an officer in the Air National Guard. The past couple of years, the Air Force has instituted these barrier analysis working groups, which they've used to help address issues for female service members, changing dress and appearance standards, which has been really beneficial to females, especially females of color. They have a LGBT initiative task force spearheaded by a queer two-star general, who I'm sure you're familiar with. What are your thoughts on these services conducting these internal looks and audits on themselves and how those policies affect their service members? And what are your thoughts on actually elevating that to a DoD-wide level as opposed to allowing each individual service to set their own separate individual policies? And what role does your organization play in informing and advising those working groups?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Jimmy. I am very, very involved with, or at least aware of, the ongoing efforts, not only with the WIT, which is the Women's Initiative Task Force, and also with the LIT, which is the LGBTQ Initiative I guess it's team, not task force, but team. And I think like the Air Force and, well, the Department of the Air Force / Space Force is like leading the way. They may not have in the past, but like right now with their hair standards and their, women's change, like uniforms for maternity, maternity uniforms that are free. I mean, we don't have to have a tax on, on getting pregnant, which is a great thing, or disclosing that your pregnancy status until later is like just great things. And then the Air Force, like this year, they did a really good job. I mean, I am very well aware of what General Lauterbach does. I mean, she's a wonderful ally, and I think that being led by somebody that's a part of the community and had the experience is crucial. And I think the retention and recruitment of the Air Force and the Space Force is just going to continue. I think you're going to have people that are continuing to serve at higher rates in those services if they're LGBTQ, and they're actually seen. And we're actually seeing, we've only had a handful of folks that are out at those levels. And so when we see, people that are higher ranking in those positions, then you can see yourself in that, which is the same example of whether you agree or not with the political office for the current administration. Like, this was the first time we had a vice president that was a woman and a person of color. And it was for the first time many people that could see themselves finally as the vice president, like as a woman. And I think we're seeing the same thing. And I think like 100% they should do this across the board. And it should be, they should talk. They were, in Texas, the Air Force did release some maybe not guidance, but just they acknowledge what happened in Texas with families, and they put out, I believe, a memo. And, I even met with the Undersecretary of the Air Force, Gina Ortiz-Jones, a couple weeks ago, and was like, this is what we, very well informed, and was asking, what can we do for the families? So people are, the Air Force is doing stuff, and I wish that other branches were doing it as vocally. But I do have to shout out to the Marines, because every Pride Month, they have the best Facebook responses. I think his name's Yarborough. I don't know if that's correct or not. But he is the best respondent of comments during Pride for Marines. So if you haven't seen that, go back and look on the archives of Pride. But yeah, so I think that the Air Force is definitely the leading one when it comes to the inclusion. And I actually helped with the barrier analysis for the LGBTQ task force. Nobody knows that, I don't think. But spoiler alert, I did.
Now we know.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your vulnerability, your leadership in this space, and your fortitude in advocating for queer service members and veterans. I hope I'm not speaking out of line, but I think one of the struggles that I find in doing this is that we're not only advocating for other people, but also advocating for ourselves. So when we're told that our existence doesn't matter, it's very hurtful. And it shows that there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. And the fact that you're able to go about this strategically conveys that fortitude that you have. So thank you. Yes, thank you. And I always say, because I get a lot of hate mail and a lot of messages that aren't very kind on Facebook, and I say that day that I don't get those is the day I need to stop working. So every message that I get that's hateful, I use that and say, or every politician that says, we don't matter. I use that as a point of continuing forward. We still have work to do. It may not happen today or tomorrow, but we still have work to do that we can achieve this. Thank you.